The sun had barely begun its climb over the jagged peaks when Taji, a young Apache scout, crested the ridge above the canyon. The storm from the night before had left the landscape transformed, rocks slick with rain, small rivulets racing down the cliffs, and the air still heavy with the smell of wet earth and sagebrush. Taji paused to catch his breath, his dark eyes scanning the terrain below. The canyon stretched like a scar through the desert, narrow and twisting with sheer cliffs rising on either side. He knew this canyon well, or at least he thought he did. Yet in the aftermath of the storm, every shadow seemed more mysterious, every movement more threatening. Taji's hand instinctively went to the bough slung across his back. A rustle among the mesquite bushes caught his attention. He froze, ears straining. Only the wind? Only the water tumbling over the rocks? No, there it was again. A subtle snapping of twigs too deliberate to be natural. He crouched low, letting the soft soil and rocks absorb his weight. Moving quietly, he followed the sound, the rhythm of his heart blending with the whispers of the canyon. He could smell the rain still clinging to the earth, the sharp tang of the creosote bushes, and faintly, a scent that didn't belong. Iron and blood. Taji's pulse quickened. Human blood was rare in these parts. The Apache were careful and vigilant, and outsiders even more so. He traced the streaks across the rocks, noting the red droplets darkening against the pale stone. Someone was hurt. Or worse. The canyon narrowed suddenly, the walls closing in like arms ready to trap him. He slowed, every step deliberate. Then he saw her. She lay sprawled among the low bushes, her body partially hidden by the mesquite branches. Rain had plastered her dark hair against her pale, dirt-smudged face. One arm was awkwardly twisted and her shoulder bore a crude arrow, the fletching still quivering faintly as if in pain. Her chest rose and fell weakly, but she was alive. Taji's first instinct was caution. She might be a scout from a rival band, or worse, a trap. But something about the way she lay there, trembling yet unbroken, sparked the deepest part of his Apache honor, a duty to protect the weak and innocent when he could. He moved closer, speaking softly, his voice blending with the canyon wind. "I mean no harm. Can you hear me?" No answer. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a sharp, frightened intelligence that seemed to measure him, weighing friend from foe. Then she sank back, exhausted. Taji knelt beside her, carefully examining the wound. The arrow was lodged awkwardly, but the bleeding had slowed. He knew the medicinal herbs nearby, the roots and leaves his mother had taught him to use for healing. He reached for them, his hand steady despite the adrenaline. Pulling out his knife, he prepared to remove the arrow, murmuring soothing words as he worked. The storm's aftermath had left debris scattered across the canyon floor, but Taji found a flat rock near the stream, using it as a makeshift table to tend her wound. Every now and then he glanced around, listening for the sound of pursuers, for the faintest rustle of more footsteps. The canyon, usually a place of hunting and solitude, now seemed filled with unseen eyes. When he finally lifted her gently to move her deeper into the shelter of a small overhang, Taji felt a flicker of unease. Whoever she was, this girl had a story, and it was not yet fully revealed. Something about the set of her jaw, the tension in her small but resilient frame, told him she was no ordinary traveler. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows down the canyon walls, Taji whispered almost to himself, "You're safe, for now." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the sense that this encounter, this canyon, and this girl were only the beginning of a path that would change everything. Taji guided the girl deeper into the canyon, his careful steps crunching over loose stones. The rain had left the ground slick, and he had to balance her weight with his own, steadying her as they moved. She was surprisingly light for her age, yet every movement sent a sharp wince across her face. He kept speaking softly, almost a chant, to reassure her, though she didn't answer. When they reached a small alcove tucked behind a cluster of boulders, Taji set her down gently. The space was naturally sheltered from wind and rain, with enough overhanging rock to protect from the sun. It wasn't much, but it was safe for now. He observed her closely. The arrow had pierced just above the shoulder, angled slightly, and the wound had begun to swell. Her clothing was torn, streaked with blood and mud, and her skin bore the faint scratches of brush and rock. He tore a strip from his own shirt to staunch the bleeding, knotting it gently around her upper arm. The girl let out a faint groan but did not resist. Her dark eyes, now fully open, studied him warily, sharp and alert despite her weakness. There was no fear of him, at least not entirely, but there was caution, the kind of instinct that told him she had survived dangers far worse than a mere storm. Taji reached into his small pack for the herbs he had gathered. Sage, willow bark, and a few dried leaves he recognized for their antiseptic properties. Crushing them into a paste, he applied it around the wound with slow, deliberate movements. "It will sting," he warned softly, "but it will help you heal." She flinched but didn't pull away. The corners of her mouth twitched in a faint grimace. Pain mingled with defiance. Taji realized as he worked that she was not just a child lost in the wilderness. Her posture, the intensity in her gaze, and the precision with which she avoided unnecessary movement all suggested training, discipline, and perhaps survival skills beyond her years. Hours passed. Taji built a small fire near the mouth of the alcove, careful to keep it low and hidden from any prying eyes. Smoke curled upward, the scent of sage mixing with the damp earth. The girl, too weak to move, leaned against the rock wall, her hair damp and matted, her eyes tracking his every motion. When he offered her water from a small hide pouch, she drank cautiously, sipping, never losing her guarded composure. Even in her silence, Taji felt the weight of her presence. The canyon, with its high walls and twisting paths, had always been a place of solace and solitude for him. But now, with her here, it became a shared space, intimate yet fraught with tension. She was a puzzle he could not yet solve, a story he had only glimpsed the first chapter of. As evening fell, painting the canyon walls in shades of crimson and gold, he realized that he needed to give her a name. Not her real name, he didn't know it, but something to acknowledge her existence. "Moon," he murmured, using the Apache word Nalin, pointing to the rising moon through the rock gap above. She didn't answer, but she looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of recognition, of connection. That night, Taji kept watch. He listened for the distant sounds of predators, the faint echo of footsteps that might belong to humans, and the whisper of the canyon wind through the crevices. Every so often he glanced at Nalin, noting the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the way her hand twitched ever so slightly toward the arrow wound. Though she spoke no words, Taji felt her story pressing against the silence. Whoever she was, she had fled something or someone, and the wounds she carried were only part of a larger danger. And as the moonlight bathed the canyon in silver, Taji resolved silently that he would protect her, even if the cost was his own safety. For the first time since he had entered the canyon that morning, he allowed himself a cautious thought. This girl was extraordinary, and their meeting was no accident. The canyon had brought them together, and whatever lay ahead, he knew their lives were now intertwined in ways neither of them yet understood. Taji sat beside Nalin through the night, the faint glow of the fire reflecting in his eyes. Every crackle of wood, every distant howl of a coyote made him tense. The canyon, usually his sanctuary, felt like a labyrinth of hidden threats. He had always trusted its silence, its predictable rhythms. Tonight, however, the air seemed charged with danger. He could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes pressing from the shadows. He examined Nalin again, the arrow protruding awkwardly from her shoulder. He knew he had to remove it carefully to prevent infection or further injury, but the act carried risk. Any sound could alert anyone hunting her, and he had no idea who they were. They could be outsiders, rival Apache bands, or opportunistic raiders, yet leaving her in pain or allowing the wound to fester was not an option. Taji drew a slow breath and spoke softly. "I do not know who you are, or why you are here, but I will help you. You must trust me." The girl's eyes, dark and wary, met his. She said nothing, but the sharpness in her gaze spoke volumes. She had survived hardship before, perhaps more than he could imagine, and yet the tension in her shoulders betrayed exhaustion and pain. Taji understood her silence as defiance, a shield formed over months or years of danger and loss. He looked around the alcove, noting the limited options. The fire was low and safe, and the rocks provided partial concealment. He could try to carry her deeper into the canyon, but that risked slipping on wet stones. He could leave her here and return for more supplies, but that meant leaving her alone in a vulnerable state. Every choice carried risk, yet inaction was not an option. Taji knew the rules of survival as well as anyone. A scout could not abandon the weak, especially those who could not defend themselves. He decided the only way forward was to take full responsibility for her until she could move on her own. Carefully, he positioned her so that her injured shoulder rested comfortably against a soft bundle of dried grass. Using a strip of cloth from his own garments, he secured the makeshift sling to immobilize the wound. He spoke in quiet tones, explaining each movement as he worked, hoping to calm both her body and spirit. Hours passed with no sound beyond the rustling wind and occasional drip of water from overhanging rocks. Taji began to notice subtle details, the way her fingers twitched slightly at the slightest discomfort, the tension in her jaw, the way her chest rose unevenly with each breath. He realized she was far more resilient than most children her age, a fact that both reassured and concerned him. Whoever she was, she carried a strength that demanded respect, even as she needed care. As dawn approached, the fire had died down to glowing embers. Taji glanced at the canyon entrance, alert for any movement. His decision had been made. He would not abandon her, and he would take the risk of staying with her until she recovered enough to move safely. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, but he welcomed it. A scout's honor was measured by the choices made in moments of danger, not by ease or comfort. He tried again to coax her into words. "Tell me your name. Tell me where you are from. If you remain silent, I cannot help you fully." The girl shifted slightly, finally meeting his eyes with a flicker of recognition, almost as if acknowledging his courage. She did not speak, yet her silence no longer felt hostile. It felt deliberate, a guarded trust forming in small increments. Taji realized the magnitude of his decision. By choosing to help her, he had bound his fate to hers. The canyon, once a solitary domain, had now become a shared space of vigilance, care, and quiet determination. And though he could not yet know the dangers that lay ahead, he understood one unshakable truth. The girl's survival, and perhaps his own, depended on the courage of this single, risky decision. As he settled beside her, watching the first streaks of sunlight strike the canyon walls, Taji whispered almost as much to himself as to her, "We survive together, until there is no other choice but to face what comes next." The morning sun filtered through the canyon, casting streaks of gold across the jagged rocks. Nalin remained silent, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the alcove, as if she could see the movements of a hidden world that Taji could not. She had not spoken a word since the night he found her, and every attempt he made to draw even a whisper met only with a guarded stare. Taji understood the silence as a test. She was cautious, perhaps mistrustful of men, or maybe she had learned to speak only when necessary. Still, he felt the weight of unspoken stories pressing against him. Every scar, every grimace, every flicker of her gaze hinted at a life filled with peril. The canyon, with all its open skies and winding paths, had become a crucible where their fates were intertwined. He settled beside her, careful not to crowd the space she had claimed. "You need not speak yet," he said softly, "but I must understand you if I am to help." His voice was steady, a contrast to the tension in the air. Nalin's eyes flicked toward him briefly and then away, tracing a line along the rocks as though she were measuring the distance between trust and danger. For hours, Taji worked quietly, tending the small fire, gathering water from the stream, and preparing a modest meal of roasted roots and dried meat. Nalin observed each motion intently, occasionally moving her hand toward the water to take a sip. Never more. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, and alert, a mirror to a mind constantly calculating risk. Taji could not help but notice the precision in her movements, the controlled way she adjusted her position to ease the pressure on her wound. She did not panic when he cleaned the dried blood from her shoulder, nor did she flinch when he applied a fresh layer of medicinal herbs. Instead, she watched him as though evaluating him, testing whether his intentions were genuine. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shifted across the canyon walls, creating a rhythm of light and dark. Nalin finally spoke, not in words but in a subtle gesture. She lifted a finger to the air, indicating the wound on her shoulder, then traced the path of the arrow with careful precision. Taji nodded, understanding the silent communication. This was her way of telling him that she could not yet trust words, but she could acknowledge gestures. Taji admired her resolve. Few children, even those trained in the ways of survival, could maintain such composure after suffering a wound so severe. Her silence was not defiance. It was discipline, patience, and a quiet assertion of control over her own body and choices. He decided to respect it. Words were unnecessary for now. Actions and attentiveness would speak louder. He arranged the fire and bedding so that she could rest safely, offering comfort without intrusion. He spoke occasionally, not expecting answers, sharing observations about the canyon, the patterns of the sun, and the distant cries of birds. Each sentence was measured, gentle, and non-threatening, a bridge of understanding built without demands. Hours melted into afternoon. Nalin shifted slightly, moving closer to the fire as if seeking warmth not just from the sun, but from his presence. Taji noticed the subtle relaxation in her shoulders, the fleeting easing of tension in her jaw. The silence that had once felt impenetrable now seemed to hum with possibility, a fragile trust forming in the quiet spaces between them. As evening approached, Taji began to wonder about the story behind her eyes. Why had she been alone in the canyon? Why had no one come searching for her? And why did she carry herself with such precision and awareness beyond her years? The answers were hidden, tucked beneath the surface of her silence, waiting for the right moment to emerge. When the first stars appeared, glimmering faintly through the canyon's narrow opening, Taji spoke softly again. "You are safe for now," he said. "And when the time comes, you may tell me your name, your story, all that you wish to share. Until then, I will watch over you." Nalin's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. She did not speak, but the look she gave him was enough. In that moment, Taji understood that trust, like courage, was earned, not demanded. And in the canyon, beneath the rising moon, a bond was forming between two souls, tenuous yet undeniable, waiting for the trials ahead to test its strength. The canyon had grown quieter by midday, the soft gurgle of the stream and the distant cries of hawks the only sounds breaking the silence. Taji sat near the fire, sharpening a small hunting knife when something caught his eye, a set of footprints along the damp soil near the stream. He froze. The prints were human, larger than Nalin's, pressed into the mud in haste. They were fresh, barely hours old and heading toward the alcove where they had taken refuge. Taji's heart tightened. Someone was following her. He motioned for Nalin to stay low. Her eyes widened slightly at the urgent gesture, but she did not speak. She had learned to read his movements. She understood. Taji whispered softly, "Stay here, be quiet. Do not move." Creeping along the edges of the alcove, he traced the prints. They were made by 3 riders, each wearing heavy boots that scuffed the rocks and soil in uneven patterns. Taji's mind raced. He did not recognize the tracks as belonging to neighboring Apache bands he knew, but that did not mean they were friendly. Raiders, mercenaries, or enemies seeking her specifically could be anywhere, and the canyon's twists and turns provided them many chances to ambush. Returning to Nalin, Taji scanned the horizon, noting vantage points where attackers could appear. "They are close," he said, voice low. "We must move." Nalin's eyes flicked to him, sharp and calculating. She did not protest. With effort, she rose, leaning on him as they navigated the rocky path deeper into the canyon. Taji led her along hidden side trails, ones he had used for hunting and escape, their narrow paths winding between jagged boulders and steep cliffs. Every step was deliberate. The canyon was treacherous, but it now became a shield as well as a trap. As they descended into a tighter section of the canyon, Taji noticed subtle signs of pursuit beyond the prints. Branches had been snapped recently, disturbed in a pattern inconsistent with the storm's effects. Stones that should have remained in place were shifted, and the faint echo of hooves on distant rock hinted at riders attempting to flank them. Whoever was following Nalin was skilled and determined. They knew the canyon well enough to track without leaving obvious evidence. He quickened his pace, using the natural cover of the rocks to shield their movement. Nalin's breathing was steady, her face set in determined focus despite the pain she still carried. Taji admired her resolve. She was more than a survivor. She was a fighter in every sense. They reached a small alcove hidden behind a wall of boulders, a place Taji had used once to escape from a bear years ago. "Here?" He paused, crouched behind the stone, and whispered, "We stay here for a moment. Watch the trail." Nalin leaned slightly against him, her eyes scanning the canyon below. Even in silence, her alertness was sharp, her instincts finely tuned. Taji realized that her survival thus far had been no accident. She had the intuition and skills of someone trained to evade danger, yet the presence of multiple pursuers reminded him that her abilities alone were not enough. Hours passed in tense quiet. The canyon seemed to hold its breath along with them. Every rustle, every shift in shadow made Taji ready his weapon, bow and arrows at the ready. Nalin stayed close, her eyes flicking between him and the narrow trail that wound through the canyon floor. As dusk approached, Taji noticed movement, 3 figures on horseback, cautiously advancing along the lower paths. They were heavily armed, carrying bows and spears. Their attention seemed focused, almost predatory. Taji's mind raced, weighing options. They could attempt to flee, but the canyon's narrow walls limited mobility. They could try to hide, but the pursuer's experience made detection likely. He laid a hand gently on Nalin's shoulder. "They are here," he said, voice calm but firm. "We fight if we must and we hide if we can, but you will not be taken." Nalin's eyes met his, a silent agreement passing between them. She did not speak, but her posture mirrored his resolve. Ready, cautious, and fearless. The canyon's shadows lengthened, stretching toward the approaching riders. For Taji and Nalin, the coming night would test everything. Their courage, their cunning, and the bond quietly growing between them. And somewhere deep in the twisting rock walls, the canyon seemed to whisper that nothing would ever be the same again. The canyon had grown colder as night settled over its jagged walls, and the fire that Taji had carefully built was now little more than glowing embers. The 3 riders from earlier had disappeared from sight, but the sense of being hunted lingered like a shadow across the rocks. Taji knew better than to let his guard down, yet he also understood that Nalin needed rest if she was to survive the next day. He guided her to a narrow ledge behind a tangle of mesquite and cactus. It was not comfortable, but it offered concealment. Carefully, he helped her sit against a large boulder, arranging a blanket to support her back. Her shoulder wound throbbed with every movement, yet she did not complain. Taji admired the quiet strength she displayed, an endurance born not of privilege but of survival. As he settled nearby, keeping watch over the canyon's winding paths, Taji began to speak in low, measured tones. "The canyon holds many secrets," he said. "It can hide us, but it can also betray us if we are careless." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "You are skilled, though. I have seen it in the way you move, the way you watch the shadows." Nalin finally responded, but not with words. She reached out a trembling hand, brushing a stray lock of hair from his face, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Taji felt a warmth he had not expected, a recognition that their fates were intertwined, at least for this night. He offered her a small piece of dried meat and water. She accepted them silently, nibbling carefully, eyes never leaving his. They did not need words. Actions, care, and attention sufficed. In the quiet of the canyon, a trust was beginning to form, fragile yet undeniable. Hours passed with occasional movement in the distance, the faint sounds of animals and the rustle of leaves alerting Taji to any threat. Nalin remained close, leaning lightly against him, her breathing even but shallow. He spoke again, softly, recounting stories of his own childhood, of hunting with his father, of lessons learned in the wild that could save a life or preserve honor. She listened, silent, yet her eyes glimmered with understanding, absorbing the knowledge even if she did not respond aloud. At one point, a sudden noise, rocks shifting on the canyon floor, caused them both to tense. Taji's hand flew to his knife, and Nalin instinctively moved behind him, though her eyes remained sharp, scanning the shadows. Nothing emerged from the darkness. The moment passed, leaving only the soft hiss of the fire and the distant call of a hawk. It was in this shared vigilance that Taji began to understand the depth of Nalin's resilience. She had survived alone, wounded, and yet she had retained a sharpness and awareness that most adults would envy. Her silence, once a barrier, was now a language of its own, a form of communication that transcended words. Night deepened, and the stars emerged through the narrow canyon opening. Taji leaned back against the rock, glancing at her. "You are not alone," he said quietly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Nalin's eyes softened for the first time, a flicker of trust and recognition passing between them. She did not speak, but she pressed her hand lightly against his arm, an unspoken promise. In the darkness of the canyon, amid danger and uncertainty, a bond had been forged, not just of necessity, but of mutual respect, courage, and the silent understanding that each had become the other's protector. Taji knew that the coming days would test this bond further. Whoever was pursuing her would not give up easily, and the canyon offered both sanctuary and peril. Yet for the first time he felt that they were not facing the threat as two strangers but as allies, connected by choice and circumstance. As the night deepened and the fire's embers glowed faintly, Tazi allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had found Nalin wounded and alone, a girl who spoke little but observed everything, whose presence demanded courage and care. In the harsh, unforgiving canyon, he realized that survival depended not only on skill but on trust, and in that trust, a seed of something deeper had been planted, one that could withstand even the shadows closing in around them. Night had fully descended over the canyon, and the stars glimmered like distant watchfires in the sky. Taji and Nalin crouched beside the faint embers of their fire, the warmth barely keeping the chill at bay. The day's tension lingered in the air, a constant reminder that danger was never far in these rugged cliffs. Yet, amid the peril, a quiet intimacy had formed between them, a bond forged in shared vigilance and unspoken trust. Nalin shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. Taji noticed for the first time a glint of something unusual, a small silver pendant hanging around her neck, half hidden beneath her damp hair. It caught the firelight with a subtle sparkle. The moment it reflected across the stones, Taji's heart skipped. He had seen that pendant before, during a recent gathering of the Apache tribe. It was the mark of Chief Dasan, the revered leader whose daughter had vanished weeks earlier. The pendant, engraved with a crescent moon and a single star, was known to be a token the chief's family wore, a sign of lineage and protection. Recognition hit Tazi like an arrow. The girl he had found wounded and silent, the one whose name he did not yet know, was no ordinary child. She was the chief's daughter. Taji's mind raced. Questions tumbled over one another. How had she ended up here, alone and wounded? Who had attacked her? And why had no one come searching for her until now? The answers were unclear, but the gravity of the situation was undeniable. Protecting her was no longer simply a matter of survival. It was a matter of honor, responsibility, and perhaps life or death. He cleared his throat softly, careful not to startle her. "The pendant you wear," he began, his voice gentle. "It belongs to Chief Dasan, does it not?" Nalin's eyes widened slightly, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, she shifted the pendant slightly, as though testing whether revealing its significance would bring safety or danger. Taji crouched closer, his eyes meeting hers, conveying calm reassurance. "It does not matter why you are here," he said softly. "What matters is that you are safe and that I will keep you safe. Whoever is after you will not find you so long as I can stand in their path." Her gaze lingered on his face, searching, measuring. After a long moment she spoke, her voice quiet but firm, carrying a note of both relief and resolve. I am Nalin," she said, finally naming herself. "I fled the camp. They came for me." Taji's jaw tightened. "Who came for you? Who did this?" Nalin shook her head slightly, the firelight casting shadows across her determined face. "I cannot say. They would come for my family if I spoke." Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. She carried not only her own survival, but also the fate of her tribe. The realization struck Taji deeply. This was no ordinary rescue. He was now entwined in the safety of the chief's family, and every decision from this point forward carried enormous consequence. The fire crackled softly between them, a fragile barrier against the canyon's darkness. Taji studied her closely, seeing not just a child, but a figure of courage and resilience, one who had endured attacks, fled through treacherous terrain, and still managed to maintain a sharp awareness of every shadow. "You trust me?" Taji asked gently. "Even now, after all that has happened?" Nalin's eyes softened slightly, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. She did not speak again, but the gesture was enough. In that silent acknowledgement, Taji understood that her trust, earned in the quiet hours of the canyon, had solidified. The revelation of her identity did not frighten her. It sharpened the stakes, and yet it also reaffirmed the bond that had grown between them. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. The canyon's shadows seemed less threatening now, illuminated by the newfound clarity of who she was. Whatever lay ahead, whether the pursuers returned, or new dangers arose, he knew he would face them for her. As the fire's embers faded into the night, Taji whispered softly, more to himself than to Nalin, "I will keep you safe, daughter of Chief Dasan, no matter what comes." Nalin rested her head lightly against the rock, exhausted but alert, and for the first time, the canyon felt like a place not only of danger but also of refuge, a temporary sanctuary for two souls bound together by trust, courage, and the quiet revelation of identity. The canyon's silence that night was deceptive, a fragile calm that Taji knew could shatter at any moment. The moon hung low over the cliffs, casting elongated shadows that danced across the rocky floor, and the faint rustle of leaves made every movement seem amplified. Taji kept Nalin close, her shoulder still tender from the wound, as he scanned the canyon's twists and turns with sharp, practiced eyes. Hours passed in tense watchfulness, until faint shapes began to emerge against the far cliff walls. The three riders he had tracked before, steady, deliberate, armed, were advancing cautiously, moving down the canyon floor toward their hiding place. They knew the terrain, but not intimately. Taji had the advantage of familiarity, and he used it to plan their next move. He whispered to Nalin, "Stay low. Do not speak, do not make a sound. We will move when I say. The canyon favors those who know its paths." She nodded, her dark eyes wide but resolute. Her trust, earned over days of careful care and silence, was absolute. Taji led her along a narrow, hidden trail that wound upward through jagged boulders, a route few could navigate without alerting others. Every step required precision. One slip could mean discovery. He adjusted Nalin's weight, helping her over rough stones, mindful of her injury. Despite her exhaustion, she moved with surprising agility, a testament to her training and resilience. The hunters' voices reached them in low murmurs, punctuated by occasional whistles and the clatter of horse hooves against stone. They were coordinating, clearly aware that their quarry was clever and evasive. Taji clenched his jaw. Whoever these men were, they had been sent deliberately, and they would not stop until they found her. He found a small alcove overlooking the trail below, the perfect vantage point. Taji crouched beside Nalin, readying his bow and an arrow tipped with a sharpened stone. The canyon floor stretched wide beneath them, dotted with shadows that hid the advancing riders. He whispered, "They are close, but we have the advantage. The canyon favors those who understand it." The first figure rounded a bend, moving cautiously but unaware of the trap above. Taji's heart pounded, his muscles coiled. When the rider's head turned slightly, catching the glint of moonlight on his weapon, Taji nocked the arrow. It would not kill, but would create enough distraction to buy them time. The arrow flew, striking a boulder near the rider with a sharp crack. The man startled, pulling back, his horse skidding slightly. The other two froze. Taji motioned for Nalin to follow, and they slipped along the hidden ledge above, careful to stay out of sight. The hunters began to shout, their confusion echoing against the canyon walls. Where did they go? Did they climb the cliffs? One shouted. Taji's heart beat faster, but he remained calm, leading Nalin to a series of jagged rocks and overhangs that allowed them to stay hidden while the pursuers searched blindly below. Hours passed in this tense cat-and-mouse game. The canyon, usually a place of freedom for Taji, now became a battlefield of wits and survival. Every turn required strategy. Every shadow could conceal danger. Nalin's sharp eyes scanned the paths below, silently noting the hunter's movements, and Taji realized that her instincts were as keen as his own. Together they moved as one, a silent unit, perfectly synchronized in their effort to evade capture. Finally, after a long night of careful maneuvering, the hunters, frustrated and unable to find their target, began to retreat. Taji waited until the last figure disappeared from sight before exhaling, a wave of relief mingling with lingering tension. He turned to Nalin, who remained alert, her eyes flicking across the canyon even after the danger had passed. "You are safe. For now," Taji whispered, his voice soft but firm. "They will return, but we will be ready." Nalin nodded slightly, her gaze meeting his with unspoken understanding. In that moment, amid the shadows and cliffs of the canyon, Taji realized that their survival depended not just on skill and caution, but on the bond they had forged, the trust, courage, and unyielding determination that now connected them in ways deeper than mere necessity. The canyon returned to its quiet state, the moonlight reflecting on the jagged walls, but the night had changed both of them. They were no longer simply scout and stranger. They were allies, partners bound by circumstance, ready to face whatever dangers might follow in the days ahead. The first rays of dawn touched the canyon walls with a gentle glow, painting jagged cliffs in shades of rose and gold. Taji and Nalan had spent the night hidden among rocks and sparse brush, alert to any sign of the returning hunters. The adrenaline of the previous night still pulsed through Taji's veins, but he allowed himself a small measure of relief. Nalan was unharmed, her breathing steady, and the immediate danger had passed for now. From a distant ridge, a faint sound reached Taji's ears, the rhythmic beating of hooves and the voices of men calling out in Apache tones. Relief surged through him. Chief Dasan's search party had arrived. He had sent scouts when news of his daughter's disappearance reached him, and their careful tracking had led them to the canyon. Taji guided Nalan to a small clearing near the canyon floor, where she could move more easily without risking her wound. She followed him cautiously, every step deliberate, but her eyes brightened slightly at the sound of familiar voices. Recognition, or perhaps hope, lit her features. As the search party approached, Chief Dasan himself emerged at the head of the group, mounted on a strong, dark horse. His eyes, sharp and commanding, scanned the canyon floor before settling on Taji and Nalan. For a heartbeat, the chief's expression was unreadable, a mask of authority and caution. Then, as he took in the sight of his daughter, wounded yet alive, relief and disbelief flickered across his face. "Nalan?" Chief Dasan called, his voice carrying across the canyon. The girl's response was immediate. She rose slightly, wincing from the pain in her shoulder, and stepped forward. "Father," she said, her voice firm yet trembling with emotion. The weight of weeks of fear, flight, and silence seemed to melt in that single word. The chief dismounted swiftly, moving to kneel beside her. His hands were steady as he examined her shoulder, but his eyes remained locked on her face. "You are alive," he said, more a statement of disbelief than a question. "Alive and brave." Taji remained nearby, quietly observing. He had never met the chief personally, but he knew of Dasan's reputation, strong, wise, and fiercely protective of his people. He also knew that the chief's approval was not easily earned. And yet, the moment Dasan's gaze fell upon him, there was recognition, acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to protect Nalan through the night. "You saved her," the chief said quietly, his voice carrying both gratitude and respect. Taji inclined his head slightly. "She would have perished in the canyon if I had not found her." Dasan studied him for a long moment, then extended a hand. "You have courage and honor, young scout," he said. "You acted when most would have hesitated. For that you have my thanks, and the thanks of my family." Nalan looked at Taji, a faint smile breaking through her exhaustion. She did not speak, but her eyes conveyed all the words she could not yet say: gratitude, trust, and respect. In that moment, the bond forged between scout and girl was witnessed and affirmed, not just between them but by the chief himself. The search party began preparations to leave the canyon, carefully moving Nalan to a horse and bandaging her wound more securely. Taji stayed close, ensuring she could mount safely. Chief Dasan rode beside them, his presence both protective and commanding. "You have shown great skill and loyalty," the chief said again, speaking to Taji as much as to the group. "You have honored the tribe tonight. Remember that courage is not only in battle but in protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Taji bowed his head in acknowledgement. "It was my duty," he said simply. As they rode together toward the camp, the canyon receding behind them, Taji glanced at Nalan. She leaned slightly toward him, still silent, yet her expression spoke volumes. She had survived danger, fled unknown enemies, and now returned to safety, all because of the courage and vigilance of a scout who had found her when she was most vulnerable. The canyon, once a place of isolation and threat, had become the crucible where trust, courage, and loyalty were tested and proven, and in that rugged landscape, two lives had been forever intertwined, their bond recognized not only by each other but by the chief of their people. The ride back was quiet, yet filled with a sense of relief and accomplishment. Taji knew challenges would come again. Danger was never truly gone, but for now the immediate threat had passed. And as the canyon disappeared behind the cliffs, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a mission fulfilled, and the profound honor of having protected the daughter of Chief Dasan. The sun rose over the Apache camp, golden light spilling across tents, fires, and the bustling figures of warriors, hunters, and families. For the first time in days, Nalan felt the warmth of safety, though the memory of the canyon's shadows lingered like a quiet whisper in her mind. She walked slowly, her shoulders still tender but her posture strong. Her eyes, once guarded and wary, now held a spark of recognition and trust. Taji followed close behind, his bow slung across his back and his hands steady. The camp's energy was alive with voices and movement, yet he moved with measured calm, alert to potential dangers but confident in the safety of the open space. Though the immediate threat of the pursuers had passed, the lessons of the canyon, the vigilance, the courage, the need for trust remained fresh in his mind. Nalan approached her father, Chief Dasan, who had gathered with a small circle of elders to welcome her back. His expression softened as he looked upon his daughter, alive and unharmed despite the odds. Relief and pride mingled in his gaze. "Nalan," he said, voice steady but filled with emotion, "you have shown courage beyond your years." She inclined her head slightly, a small smile breaking through. "I survived because I had help," she said quietly, glancing toward Taji. Her words, though few, carried immense weight. In them, Taji saw acknowledgement, not only of her gratitude but of the bond that had formed between them during their perilous journey through the canyon. Chief Dasan turned his attention to Taji, whose presence had been unwavering through the trials of the past days. "And you," the chief said, "you have shown honor, courage, and loyalty. You risked your life to protect my daughter. That is a deed worthy of respect among our people." Taji bowed his head, humility and pride mingling in equal measure. "It was my duty," he said simply. She could not face the canyon alone. The chief's eyes softened. "Duty is the measure of a person," he said. "But courage, the courage to act when others hesitate, is the mark of the brave. You have proven both." Nalan watched this exchange silently, but her glance toward Taji spoke volumes. In the quiet moments, she pressed her hand lightly against his arm, a gesture of trust, gratitude, and acknowledgement. It was a bond formed not through blood or family, but through shared trials, mutual respect, and the unwavering commitment to protect one another. As the day progressed, the camp celebrated her safe return with quiet relief rather than exuberant ceremony. Stories were exchanged, advice given, and healers attended to her wound. Taji remained nearby, ever vigilant, but also finally allowed himself a measure of ease. He had guided Nalan through the perilous canyon, evaded their pursuers, and returned her safely to her father. The weight of responsibility was heavy, yet fulfilling. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Nalan and Taji stood together on a low rise overlooking the canyon where their journey had begun. The vast expanse stretched below them, cliffs and shadows etched with memory. She looked at him, her voice finally steady and clear. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Taji nodded, his expression calm but reflective. "We survived together," he replied. "That is all that matters." For a long moment they stood in silence, the wind carrying the scent of sage and earth through the air. Neither spoke, yet the unspoken words were understood. Courage, loyalty, and trust had created a bond stronger than mere friendship, a connection that would endure far beyond the canyon, beyond the dangers of any pursuit and beyond the limitations of circumstance. As they descended toward the camp, Taji realized that this bond was rare and precious. It was forged not in comfort or ease, but in the fires of challenge and the quiet vigilance of shared survival. Nalan had been the daughter of a chief, a girl of status and destiny. Yet in the canyon she had been simply human, vulnerable, brave, and in need of protection. Together they had faced that truth and emerged stronger. Chief Dasan watched them from the camp center, a quiet satisfaction on his face. He understood that the canyon had tested not only his daughter, but also the scout who had protected her. In the safety of the camp, surrounded by his people, he knew that trust, honor, and courage had triumphed. The canyon, once a place of shadows and danger, now remained etched in memory, a testament to what could be achieved when two lives intersected under the harshest of circumstances. And as Nalan and Taji walked together side by side, it was clear that their paths, once defined by chance, were now joined by a bond beyond blood, forged in courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable strength of trust.